Lovely. Right. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see you. I'm Becky. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the English Association, and I'm really pleased to be hosting this afternoon's conversation about building confidence in using diverse texts. Just a quick word about the English Association. We are a learned society and a subject association formed in 1906 to promote, support, and defend the discipline of English studies. We cover all stages of education from primary and early years through to secondary and further education to higher education and beyond. And we cover all parts of the discipline across language, linguistics, literature, and creative writing. Events like this one are made possible by the fantastic contribution of our volunteer speakers. So thank you so much to our speakers this afternoon. And also our members make it possible for us to keep these events free and open to all by paying their membership fees. So if you would like to contribute to the national conversation about English and help support our discipline, please do consider joining us. It costs just £53 to support our events, campaigning and advocacy work for a whole year. And you get access to a range of member benefits, including online access to all our journals. Right, enough from me for the moment. I am going to hand over to Jo Heathcott to kick us off. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. So thank you for inviting me this afternoon. Just a word to say that Jamila Boothman is unable to join us, I'm afraid, this afternoon due to family circumstances. But we do have Joanne Benjamin Lewis with us today, and Ali Al Jamri will be joining us shortly. So first of all, just to get us started on this project and on this topic, obviously I've been a teacher for a long time, Becky, up here in Manchester, more decades now actually than I care to remember. Within that role, I've also been then a principal examiner for a major exam board. Over the years, I've been really lucky to be able to write myself textbooks and study guides. And quite recently have contributed with a team that involved Joanne and Jamila and Ali on a collection of diverse texts from HarperCollins. We started off working with Key Stage 3, and we put together an anthology of texts and lesson plans. And it was interesting that during that project that we were working on, we were asked to kind of come up with ideas and come up with potential texts to help people, diversify their curriculum. And what became apparent very quickly was the volume of texts that we could actually potentially use. And so our initial anthology of 24 texts, I think, if Joanne remembers the kind of we were quite traumatized by the spreadsheet, I think, Joanne, in the end.
Yeah, there was probably
We
like
had so
nearly
much stuff.
like 90 texts.
Yeah,
You're
it was
trying
kind of
to
reining it
argue which
in.
ones to use.
So that was quite interesting to think, oh, hang on a minute, it's not as difficult as you might think to kind of curate those texts. It's just a matter of having a bit of time, a bit of imagination, a bit of teamwork as well, I think was really important. And that project came about because post-pandemic, I was working on a project with Teach First, and that is where I met Joanne. And I'm going to hand over to Joanne just to say a little bit about how we met and what Joanne's role is, and take it from there. So over to you, Joanne.
Thank you, Jo, and thank you, Becky. It's really lovely to be here, and thanks for the invitation. So I'm Joanne Benjamin Lewis, and I currently work for Teach First. I'm a subject development lead, which in everyday language means that I train English teachers, and I'm also the chair of our ethnicity and race network. So Jo and I met when we were working on a wonderful project, training academic mentors and placing them in schools so they can support many of the sort of schools that have some real challenges around support within the classroom. So that's where we met and we developed, well, very much Joe developed a curriculum to support our academic mentors. And whilst we were at Teach First in 2020, is it that long ago?
It certainly is.
Wow,
It seems like
2020.
yesterday.
Came out a missing pages report, which I'm sure many of you will have read. And it was looking at how we go about increasing racial diversity in the English literature curriculum after finding that many young people left school without ever reading a book written by a minority ethnic author or a Black author in particular, and also finding that GCSE texts had no lead characters. So 80% of the GCSE text had no lead character, which was Black, and in fact only 2 ethnic minority characters were found in some of the other books. So there was a real disparity there in terms of looking at the demographics of our schools. Teach First is a charity that works primarily in schools in challenging circumstances, many of them in inner city sort of contexts, and the schools are incredibly diverse, but that's never replicated in the curriculum. Teachers, especially English teachers, I think we found about 75% said that they were really concerned about the lack of diversity amongst the English curriculum, and they wanted more support. You know, what you were just talking about there, Joe, about having, they've got the ideas, but what about the time, and how do you get to liaise with others and share your ideas and put things together? We know what schools are like, incredibly busy and you know, sort of very stretched places, and that's, I think, really how the HarperCollins work came about. We wanted to fill that gap. So how could we help support teachers who really want to diversify their curriculum, and by narrowing down that range of texts, coming up with support resources, so we, you know, kind of background on the author and the context. We created worksheets, online resources, opportunities to link that in with the exam material, so that it was like really purposeful. So we did a lot of work around that. So in particular, Who We Are is the Key Stage 3 text, and Through Our Eyes, Key Stage 4. And then we were really blessed to be able to follow that through to the Key Stage 5 anthology as well. So that gives a little bit of background in terms of me. So like Joe, and like probably many of you, I've been a head of English. Many of you will be second of English. You may be in charge of leading literacy across the curriculum. If you are a librarian, oh, what a privilege it would be, you know, for us to have some librarians amongst those listening in, because we know that many schools no longer have in-school libraries. So we know that there will be many of you from lots and lots of different roles, and we hope that you'll find our discussion useful. So I'm going to hand back to Joe, who's going to, I think, do our kind of hostess with the mostess today, and take it forward.
I'll do my best. You mentioned about how busy schools are, Joanne, and Ali has joined us hot from the school trip, and I can see that Ali has now arrived home straight from the school trip. So thank you for joining us, Ali. Would you like to just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you, or tell our delegates today a little bit about you, how we met, your foray into English teaching, and you know, a little bit about your other hat that you wear as a published poet. Over to you, Ali.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, thank you, Rebecca, and everyone for joining. I was in the Manchester Poetry Library we left about an hour and a half ago, and it's just been a mad 2 hours to get back to in time for this. But I'm Ali. I am a teacher. I've been a teacher since 2021, but I've been in school since 2020, which is how I met Joe, because I started off as an academic mentor, and then you were one of the leads for that program with Teach First, and we had some really interesting conversations about poetry and diverse texts, which led us to the HarperCollins work, which I think Joanne's already talked really passionately about, so I won't go too much into that side. I'm a teacher of English in Key Stage 3 and 4. I'm also a poet, so I'm one of Manchester's multilingual city poets. So I write kind of publicly, I write as a translator as well, I write prose. And so I'm always constantly thinking about the diversity of the classroom, because I myself was often that one Arab kid at the back of the class, or I very much remember being about 18 to 20 and really realizing I have this identity that has been left out to dry in my education. I have nothing to grip onto from my education. I had to go out and search it for myself. And I guess that memory of, that really stark realization that I haven't been do you know what? As I've been talking about Arabic, I've just got a Zoom pop-up that says, confirm your speaking language, whether it's Arabic or not. And I think it's listening to me and trying to be more clever than it is. And so, yeah, that's that feeling of feeling completely unhinged from my work, from my schooling, in terms of there's no link between the schooling and the identity, really drives me. And I think when I want to touch on the word diversity and decolonizing for a moment, because for me, and I've heard it said before, diversity, with diversity, it's like white children have a mirror to them in their literature, whereas minority ethnic children have a window. And it's this idea of like, are you reflected, or are you just seeing how others live? And perhaps diversity is making sure that everyone has a mirror and everyone has a window. But for me, decolonizing is something else. Decolonial literature education, what does that mean? And it's become a buzzword. And I'm reminded of a phrase that really came about, particularly during the Black Lives Matter movement a few years ago, at its height a few years ago, because it still exists, is that decolonizing is not a metaphor. It's an action, it's a verb. To decolonize, if you look into it, what does that mean? It means to dismantle a system of oppression. We're very good at that when it comes to feminist discourses. And I think when we teach, generally, we are conscious to get both our male and female students to think very critically, and students of all genders to think very critically about what are we feeding them regarding gender roles, whether this might be outdated, even though it's part of the canon. Do we subscribe to this? Can women overcome this? What, feminist readings of Lady Macbeth, for instance. When we're thinking of decolonial, then we're thinking about how do we address racism. And really, a successful decolonial curriculum is highly radical, because what it's trying to do is teach children to protest against racism and imperialism. And we live in a heartland of imperialism. So that is a very very kind of radical and potentially scary thing that we might be teaching them. I wanted to share one slide, and I will just reshare that now that I've actually shared it. So this poem really drives me. I just wanted to share it really quickly. So we've hit this looter a dozen times, and he's there on the ground, sort of inside out. And this is one of the only references to an Arab person in the English curriculum, and it's from the Paran
Poetry anthology, isn't it?
Poetry anthology.
Yeah.
So it's from Remains, and actually you might be one of the 40,000 teachers who have watched this with their classes, the documentary that it comes from. And if you actually watch it all the way to the end, to this part, he actually says, in some distant excuse my language, sun-fucked Stone Age land. And this is in reference to Iraq. And this is one of the few references to Arabs. And it is one of it's one of these poems which is actually incredibly dehumanizing. So for many students across England and Wales, this might be the sum total of their knowledge of Arabs, is the Arab as a barbarian, the Arab as a terrorist, the Arab as a looter. And what's that impact? Well, if you look at all the wars Britain's been involved in since 2000, Iraq, Libya, ISIS, Saudi, war in Yemen, Gaza, all of these wars are 5 out of the wars in that list are in Arab territories. Afghanistan is often paired up with the Arab world. So the vast majority, I probably would wager that the vast majority of casualties caused by British military in some way in the last 24 years have been Arabs. So what is it saying if we are teaching dehumanizing things about people from some fucked lands, excuse my language again, calling them looters, and then our military is mainly engaged in wars where those people are. So I put that question at the end of my introduction. Does the English curriculum in the long term help to justify British wars and military involvements in Arab countries? Because if the answer is yes, then the next question is that an okay thing? And if the answer to that is no, then what we seek to do is to decolonize that in a practical way. So I will stop sharing there, and that's the end of my intro.
Thank you, Ali. I mean, that's incredibly rich discussion points, I think, that you've raised there. And I think actually, you're right in the sense that this term, decolonizing the curriculum has been, we get buzzwords, don't we, in education, and it becomes almost like a, almost like a cliched phrase very, very quickly. But I think that really helps us to understand maybe the root causes of why it's necessary, of why it's important, of why it's such a fundamental need. And just that idea of where obviously you've used that particular example of a poem there, but also I think it's interesting the idea of where the canon comes from in the first place. That idea of the colonies, and where what I find really interesting is where the subject of English literature did not begin in England. It began in colonized nations as a way of, we talk about cultural capital today, but it was a way of embedding a particular cultural capital within colonized nations. So it is an absolutely fascinating, fascinating debate and a fascinating conversation to have. What I'd like to move on to with you both today is to think on that practical level now. We've got potentially lots of English teachers with us today or listening to the recording afterwards. And one thing that we've tasked you with today is to come up with one very practical idea that our delegates today could take away, almost like it's like a do now for teachers, where we've got those kind of in place for the students, but a very practical idea or a set of ideas that maybe our delegates could go away and implement almost straight away to kind of get the ball rolling or to build confidence within their departments, something that's not too onerous that we could do with any particular year group. So Joanne, if I come to you first, what could you throw into the mix for us there?
Well, it's not for any year group, because I thought, well, the year 11s have gone, the year 10s are probably on work experience. So I was thinking, this is going to be Key Stage 3. And as many of you may be aware or maybe not aware, that on the 22nd of June, it's Windrush Day. And it's a day that has been, let me say, probably about 7-8 years now in existence. And on that day in the UK, we look to celebrate those who are described as being from the Windrush generation who came to the UK in the late 40s and 50s to support the rebuilding of the country after the Second World War, and very much working in lots of industries like nursing, transport, postal services, engineering, a whole plethora of different industries to support the rebuilding of the country. And some of you may be also aware of what's described as a Windrush scandal that took place. So I focused on that as my thinking around what would be a good topic for Key Stage 3. And if our delegates were able to get hold of our textbook, which I know that we will share later on, it's called Who We Are. Within that is an extract from the brilliant Professor David Olusoga, Black and British. So you could do a look at an extract from the text, which looks at the fact that Black people have been in the UK long before the Windrush whole era, and that in fact going back to Roman times, and it has with it background resources, questions and articles, so you could do some very focused looking at non-fiction work. The actual book is brilliant, and there are also documentaries which are available on iPlayer, so you could link in with your reading of the text, and there's a young people's version of the book specifically for teenagers. Following on from that, and again, to get your pupils really interested, you could use an animation, amazing organization called the Black Curriculum. So if you have a look at their website and look via YouTube, they have something called Black British History Animations, which again tells the story of many really sort of leading Black Britons from Mary Seacole, who I believe was the extract was in the exam paper this year. So there's another extract that you could look at. And then also getting your young people to do some creative work. So either reading some poetry from the sadly now passed Benjamin Zephaniah would be a really great thing that you could do before the end of term, and building opportunities for things like studying a real well-known Black Briton and then interviewing them, so writing an article, also using media technology, so you could do a something like a vlog, video opportunities to ask questions. And then, of course, some creative writing. So again, you could look at something like, let us say, an extract from Small Island, although we know that that's predominantly a Key Stage 5 text, but you could look at an extract from that and then build in some really lovely creative writing, because it's so filled with rich imagery, would be a lovely unit of work. And the resources are already there in terms of our textbook that we cover so many of resources that would link to that. So that's it from me.
Perfect. Ali, what about you? A practical idea, a takeaway for us?
Sure. Again, another slide. So for me, I was thinking of, oh, this is very dull while it's white. I do have a bit of animation. For me, I was thinking of short stories. So the first four I'm going to show could work very well if you're thinking of science fiction, dystopian fiction, speculative fiction with any year group. And these are 4 short story books that you could just buy one that maybe fits your intake and find a short story in there that would fit with them. So first one is Palestine plus 100, Iraq plus 100, Egypt plus 100, and Kurdistan plus 100. Egypt plus 100 actually doesn't come out until October, I realized after I made these slides. So it's actually the first 3, Kurdistan plus 100 plus recent.
Yeah.
They're all by Comma Press. The plus 100 is 100 years. So Palestine plus 100 is set 100 years after the Nakba, or the founding of Israel. So 2048. Iraq plus 100 is 100 years after the Iraq War. Egypt plus 100 is 100 years after the Arab Spring. So you could buy these books. And I would say, you know, if you've got a lot of Iraqi students, or if you know that there's a cultural link between to one of these countries in particular and your school students, I would get one of these, and you could just select one of these texts. Again, for year 10, could work as a language paper 1 extract if you want to put together one of those. Now, Comma Press has a lot of other books. They've got a city series. So I've got, this is the animation, the Book of Beijing, the Book of Cairo, the Book of Dhaka, the Book of Gaza, the Book of Havana, the Book of Istanbul, the Book of Jakarta, the Book of Khartoum, the Book of Ramallah, the Book of Rio, the Book of Shanghai, the Book of Tehran, the Book of Tbilisi, the Book of Tokyo, and that's it. So this idea that I had is other visions of the world. You don't have to look beyond one publisher who is a fantastic publisher, and maybe because I'm in Manchester, I want to big up amazing small Manchester press. But these books are genuinely amazing.
They are brilliant, Alec. They're brilliant.
Yeah.
And I'm chipping in because I'm so excited about this, because I've been working with a school in Liverpool, and I actually found there was a Liverpool one as well that's got a whole bunch of Liverpool writers in.
There are, and so you've got also the Book of Liverpool, the Book of Coventry, the Book of Leeds. There isn't a Book of Manchester. So they've also got a UK series, and they've got European cities. They've got the Book of Barcelona, but I wanted to focus on the beyond Europe.
Yeah.
And I wanted to show how, because I know I sometimes feel like I want to include a diverse text, and then I get a brain freeze. And really, you can go to commapress.com. You've got two links, and you've got the Black Curriculum from Joanne, and you've got commapress.com. You could go to those two, and you can pick up so many resources, and one of these surely will fit with one of your student bodies. And it could even be a task of, you might say, okay, I'm not teaching short stories, and we're not doing language paper 1 this half term, but you could make it your thing that you'll read and select one. You'll have one in bank one for the next semester, the next school year. So that's my idea.
Fantastic. I mean, gosh, how many, there's a whole selection in there as well. So, I mean, that is a massive range of potential prose texts there, Ali. Absolutely fantastic. The ones that I were going to throw in the mix, I did some work for a couple of academy trusts earlier this year, writing collections, writing schemes of work for them, actually, writing all the resources for a whole scheme of work. And I enjoyed, for younger readers, I enjoyed working with these two books. I have got my blurry background on. I said to Becky I haven't tidied up today, so that's why I've got my blurry background. But I have got this one here. It's called The Girl of Ink and Stars by Kieran Millwood Hargreave for Year 7. And this beautiful book here called Where the River Runs Gold by Sita Brahmacharya. It's absolutely beautiful. And for Year 7 and Year 8, I always like to start September with a class reader. Embed your class, get everything cracking. You can embed your comprehension skills, as Joanne was saying, the whole range, your analysis skills. You could pull out creative writing, you can do lots of oral work. So I think, to establish, yes, we'll put the titles in the chat for sure, Becky. Maybe you could help us out with that. So it's The Girl of Ink and Stars by Kieran Millwood Hargreave, tried and tested with a school in Bradford that I wrote all the resources for, and the Year 7 really enjoyed it. And Where the River Runs Gold, I worked with for a school in Birmingham, again with Year 8. Really sort of absolutely fascinating. This kind of touches on all kinds of interesting dystopian topics, as Ali was talking about, but linked to kind of child labour. Some really sort of fascinating stuff in here, and some beautiful writing. And one sort of suggestion, I know we often use kind of noughts and crosses, is a bit of a go-to for Year 9. But one that I came across that was actually given to me by my 14-year-old daughter, so is Western Lane. It was on sort of one of the prizes last year. I think it was the Women's Prize for Fiction. It was nominated for, but it's absolutely beautiful. Western Lane by Chetna Maru, and it discusses a young girl who plays squash, and kind of lots of kind of the permutations of her relationships with her family, with her friends, with a potential boyfriend. And it's a beautiful, it's a beautifully written novel that I think would work incredibly well for Year 9. So just to come back to you, Joanne, sort of the next sort of phases, we wanted to just say today, obviously that's their kind of takeaway ideas that could be quite quick to implement. But if there was a particular change that you would like to see, or that you would recommend for people who are evaluating their English curriculum for the coming year ahead, what would be your recommendation? Just sort of with an eye on the time, I'll come to Joanne and to Ali, but yeah, what would you recommend? What changes would you personally like to see?
So I think you've mentioned there the word evaluation. So obviously, before you do anything, you really have to know where you are at. So doing an audit of your curriculum is going to be a really important first step. And so schools need support in being able to do that. And there are resources, again, from the Black Curriculum. There's resources on BAME Ed network, also Runnymede Trust. So you can find some links there to help you to actually do that task. And again, going back to what Ali was talking about, having a mindset where you're looking at decolonizing the curriculum, it shouldn't be radical that we are encouraging young people to be anti-racist, but it is seen by some as such. So taking that as kind of like a starting point. Also, again, back to your word evaluating, what support do your staff need? So before doing anything, what starting point? Are they at a stage of not having much confidence? How are you going to build up confidence in terms of being able to deliver diverse texts, and being more specific about what does that look like? What will that CPD look like? Can it be filled by going on a course? And there are many courses around, or will it be that, you know, being involved in looking at the range of textbooks like the ones we have, looking at Penguins Lit in Colour, getting ideas from those sorts of places, will that then fill the gap? And everything that we're saying, not going to matter much unless you've got some money to be able to change and make those changes. Any action plan is not really going to be an action plan in a school, let's be honest, without some sort of budget. So trying to make sure that you have an opportunity once you've decided what you're going to do in terms of kind of plugging the gap. I mean, obviously, nice, cheap and cheerful ways of doing things would be looking at poetry. And that's always a go-to if you are struggling, because you don't have the money or the resources to be able to buy sets of text. So in our Through Your Eyes, there is a whole set of poems that you could explore. A personal favorite of mine would be looking at something like Jackie Kay, because language and sort of old tongue, looking at how people feel, how connected you are to sometimes your heritage language, the language of your parents, but also dialects that we use, and then exploring the proliferation of phrases from, let's say, Jamaican patois in everyday urban speak and music. You know, there's so much you can do around language, and that would be a beautiful starting point, looking at poetry. Your Manchester favourite, Lem Sissay, looking at his work, and a Brummy favourite, as I've said, now past, Benjamin Zephaniah. So just really pulling that together would be a really good way of ensuring that your Key Stage 4 curriculum is more diverse, would be to look at poetry in particular, especially if money is going to be an issue, because it's a way of plugging the gap. You could use diverse poems as your way into looking at the skills needed for analysing an unseen poem, for example, or linking poems to the set texts that you are reading, again, to ensure that there is that diversity in a way which is more manageable for some than having to ask to pay for whole new sets of texts.
Sure. Okay. And very quickly turning to you, Ali, a recommendation or a change that you would like to see. I've just got my eye on the time. If any of our delegates have got questions for Joanne or Ali, if you want to be typing them into the chat now, we'll try and save a few minutes at the end for delegate questions. But Ali, over to you for a recommended change.
Thank you. And I think I'm gonna combine it with a question. I know we talked about maybe adding if we had the time, but it seems we've don't so much about favorite text to teach, because it does also relate to our conversation here. And so I'll start with the recommendation first, and it kind of builds on what Joanne said about, because I was going to say something similar around that, of, you know, evaluate, do a kind of a review of the diversity of the text and so forth. But one thing I would also encourage is where there can be a blockage about thinking in anti-racist terms, and I think particularly also with white colleagues dealing with anti-race and this kind of fear sometimes that we, you know, I guess rightly have of putting our foot in our mouth in the wrong way. And, you know, I still, you know, I get that as well, because I'm only one ethnic, I might be an ethnic minority, but that doesn't make me an expert on all ethnic minorities, let alone even, it doesn't make me an expert on being Arab even. But one thing I think we already have done very well is in terms of being feminist. And we wouldn't expect our female colleagues to shoulder all of the weight of teaching in a feminist way to our female students. And we wouldn't go into a male colleague teaching Macbeth and expect them to be teaching that, you know, something problematic about, oh yeah, well, he had a point about Lady Macbeth being a bit witch-like, didn't he, in the way that she was acting. We would never expect a male colleague to teach that. And if they did that, we would immediately, you know, pull them up about it. And I think we need to, so we've already done the work in terms of being feminist, is the point I'm trying to make. And I think a lot of that thinking is something that we can take in our own reflections of, well, why am I, if I'm a male teacher, why am I not, you know, afraid to bring feminist perspectives in, but I might be a bit worried about bringing an anti-racist perspective? What do I have with feminism that I don't have with anti-racism? How can I show that up? And I think that that might be a useful way of thinking, because it is, you know, it is anti-oppression, but it's just a different type of anti-oppression. And of course, the other link related to that is a text which surprised me that I enjoyed teaching it. So I want to share it, as well as The Tempest. And I teach it to year 7 in our school. It's my first year in the school. I'd never taught The Tempest before. I read it. First time I read it, I also didn't really enjoy it. I didn't see, you know, what are we doing teaching such difficult text to year 7 out of all the Shakespeare texts you could choose? Actually, when I taught it, and maybe it's because I already go in with these kind of post-colonial thoughts and so on, we really brought out the kind of colonial relationship between Prospero and Caliban and Ariel. And actually, this is something that we can, you know, you don't even necessarily need to bring in a new text, because race is present in pretty much all of Shakespeare's texts. And I include a picture of this book, The Great White Bard by Farah Kareem Cooper. Highly readable, How to Love Shakespeare While Talking About Race. But they also discuss how even, you know, racialized language is even in famous quotes like, you know, fair is foul and foul is fair. And actually, through their research, they show how we know that fairness is related to whiteness. And I think that's something that most people are familiar with already, but how foulness, not just in that phrase, but across Shakespeare's texts and across the way that Elizabethans were talking and Jacobeans, foulness is related to blackness. So actually, even when the witches say fair is foul and foul is fair, there is a racialized element to that very famous opening to Macbeth. And so, you know, Romeo and Juliet, you've got when Romeo first lays eyes on her and compares her to a dove walking amongst crows or ravens, one of the two. So the white bird amongst the black birds, and Juliet's whiteness is part of her beauty. You've got it comes up in A Midsummer Night's Dream. It comes up in Antony and Cleopatra. It comes up in so many of his plays. And actually, we don't need to be afraid of that. We can, we can knock it on its head and say, well, we're not saying Shakespeare is racist. And actually, I think that would be highly simplistic. However, he was conscious of what he might not have called race at the time or racism, but he was conscious of it. And he does discuss it. And that's part of what makes these resonant. And so let's actually address it. And I don't think we always have. I mean, I studied The Merchant of Venice in GCSE, and I studied Othello in A level. And I actually don't recall that race was a very big part of our class discussions. And two of the most racially charged texts that he ever wrote when I was a student. So it's very possible to read these texts and completely miss this. But it's also very possible, and this means that you could, this is where you could do the theory. You don't even necessarily need to bring in a new text, because it can almost guarantee that there will be some racialized elements within a Shakespeare you're teaching that you could pick apart. And that's something, again, that you can use to kind of explore, well, how can I bring in a post-colonial lens to this text, which we already teach? So that's kind of my two recommendations. Reflecting on how we are already, by and large, feminist in our teaching as English teachers, and how we can incorporate that, and how we're usually quite confident in feminist lenses, and also looking at how we can bring it into our teaching of Shakespeare.
Perfect. Thank you, Ali. Well, just with an eye on the time, I'm just going to finish off. We've got a couple of questions in the chat, I think, Becky, if we can move to those. We've got about 2 or 3 minutes left. Just before we finish, I just was going to ask both Joanne and Ali, I don't know if we have got time, just to name a text, but we might have to save that for another day. Name a text that they've discovered that you love, or that you've enjoyed teaching, or that you would love to teach. I never get tired of telling everyone about Open Water by Caleb Azume Nelson, which is just a beautiful, brilliant read, and I think would be absolutely fabulous. I would love to teach that for A level, were it to be placed on an exam syllabus, which I'm advocating for very strongly, because I think it would make a great companion text to something like The Great Gatsby. Absolutely fabulous. If that's not been on your summer reading list, please put it on there. So Becky, I think we have got a couple of questions just to finish off with. I think, is it Kira has put a question in the chat?
Yep, so a question for Joanne. Do you have any recommended reading for books or texts about the Windrush generation? And then to pass over to Ali, do you have any recommended reading for books or texts about Palestinian history or culture?
We've got 30 seconds each. We did promise we'd finish on time.
Right, 30 seconds. So I already mentioned David Olusaga's Black and British, so you'll find information in there. For younger readers, there's Florella Benjamin's Coming to England, which is a great read looking at the experience of a child coming from Trinidad, her story coming to the UK. And we also have, through HarperCollins, a key Stage 3 text called Black and British History, which is written in a very similar style to our Through Our Eyes and Who We Are, and it looks at the Windrush generation, looks at some great, you could look at, for example, the Bristol bus boycott. So people always only ever talk about the Montgomery bus boycott in the US, but actually there was one in Bristol, and that is a great one for people to look at, and you can look at all the resources around that. And I'll just put a link in the chat for the Teach First Missing Pages resources, which also has videos, schemes of work, etc.
Okay, Ali, I think, has popped it in the chat there. for Kyra.
But I had it as a slide and I thought I wouldn't be able to show it, and now I've got an excuse.
Why not? Last 20 seconds. Over to
So
you, Ali.
I love these three. A Map of Absence. It's an anthology. It's got short fiction. It's got prose. It's got and poetry and non-fiction. It's an incredible book. This is a really great YA book, Wondrous Journeys in Strange Lands. A bit difficult to get, which I think is a good excuse to buy it so that they hopefully print more. It came out about a year ago, and it's such a wonderful short YA book that's written from a very Asian perspective in a way. It's all, they travel from, it starts in Palestine, they end up in Morocco, there's a journey via Ethiopia and Yemen towards India and back again. So it travels the whole of this kind of old world. And then there's Minor Detail, which some people might be aware of because there was some controversy with it was given an award, and then the German awarders kind of revoked it. There was a whole controversy around that in November, but it's such a beautiful novella, 100 words, 100 pages. I think it would make a really good Key Stage 5 text for the essay, that comparative essay that needs to be written. And it's just one of the best novellas I've ever read, to be frank. And so I'm coming at your answers as a literature enthusiast. So these are all literary ways into that answer of Palestinian literature. But you can also look on certain websites. Arablit.org is a really great website that's been promoting a lot of Palestinian literature. There's also a Palestinian Literary Festival. So there's good ways to easily get quite thorough lists and reading lists.
Ali, before I hand back to Becky to say good afternoon to everybody, I must tell everyone to have a look at some of your poetry as well. So please do look at the poetry of Ali Al-Jamri, which I can absolutely say is beautiful. Becky, back to you.
Thank you. Well, it's just my pleasure to say thank you so much to you, Jo, to Joanne, to Ali, for being so generous with your ideas and your time this afternoon. And thank you to all of you who are here with us, asking your questions, popping things in the chat, just being here. We really appreciate it. And I think when Jamila is back, we should maybe get back together for part 2, because there's so much
we've got more to say.
about.
We've got more to share, for sure.
We do. So thank you, everyone, and watch this space. I think we'll be back. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.